Sandra Bullock froze as Keanu screamed her name in the snow. The night was silent in a way that felt almost unreal, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes that softened every sound and turned the empty road outside Sandra's cabin into a white, endless path that seemed to stretch into a quiet dream. She had come there to find peace, to breathe again after months of noise, pressure, and a kind of emotional confusion she had not said out loud to anyone, not even the people closest to her. But that night, while she stood near the window with a warm cup between her hands, she felt something strange inside her chest, something like a slow, heavy pull that made her heartbeat quicken without warning. She did not know why, but she felt as if something was coming toward her, something she had been trying to avoid and trying to long for at the same time. Keanu had not told her he was coming. She had not told him she was here. They both had tried to create distance for reasons that made sense in their minds but hurt in their hearts. After their last emotional argument on set, Sandra thought putting miles between them would make everything calmer. She thought silence would settle things. But instead, the silence had made her feel even more lost, like she had walked into a fog she could not escape. She tried to tell herself that she was healing, but she felt more like she was drifting. She did not know that on that same night, Keanu was driving through the storm toward her, his hands tight on the wheel, his breath shaky with the words he needed to tell her, words he had held inside for far too many years. The storm grew stronger as he pushed forward, the wind hitting the car like it wanted to shove him back. He could barely see the road, but he kept going because something inside him told him that if he didn't reach her tonight, if he didn't finally say what he had been hiding, he might lose the one chance he had been too afraid to take. He had lived through loss, silence, and long stretches of loneliness, and he had always carried his pain quietly, as if speaking it would make it too real. But Sandra had been different. She had been the one person who made him feel understood without him having to explain anything. She saw him not as a star or a symbol, but as a human being trying to move forward with kindness and dignity despite everything he carried. He had never forgotten that feeling, and that was why, after their argument, something inside him broke in a way he could no longer ignore. Sandra stood near the fireplace now, watching the snow build outside in thick layers. The power flickered, leaving shadows dancing around the room. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to calm the strange anxiety rising inside her. She did not know if it was sadness or fear or something she did not want to name because naming it made it real. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the small things in the cabin, the soft crackle of burning wood, the faint smell of pine, the quiet hum of the heater. But the feeling in her chest only grew stronger, as if something in the world was calling her name. And then she heard it. At first she thought it was the wind, a sharp cry breaking through the storm. But when it came again, louder and more desperate, her whole body froze. She knew that voice. She knew it with the kind of certainty that cut through everything inside her. Keanu was screaming her name in the snow. Her heart dropped. She rushed to the window, wiping the fog from the glass with her palm. Through the thick curtain of snow, she saw a dark figure stumbling toward the cabin, the storm pulling at him from every direction. It looked unreal, like someone fighting their way through another world. Sandra felt her breath catch as she realized he must have walked part of the way when the road became too dangerous for his car. Snow clung to his hair, his jacket, his eyelashes. He looked cold, exhausted, and desperate, and Sandra felt something twist painfully inside her chest. She grabbed her coat without thinking and ran to the door, the cold air slamming into her face as soon as she opened it. Snowflakes flew into the cabin, melting on the warm floor. She stepped out into the freezing wind, her boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. The storm howled, but over the wind she heard it again, her name torn from his throat like a final plea. It made her eyes sting. When they reached each other, Keanu almost collapsed from the cold. Sandra grabbed his arms, steadying him as he leaned forward, breathing hard. His eyes were filled with something raw she had never seen in him before, fear, regret, and something deeper that shook her more than anything else. "Keanu, what are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling from the cold and from something else she could not hide anymore. He looked at her like she was the only thing keeping him standing. His breath came out in small clouds as he tried to speak, but the storm made everything harder. Finally, he managed to say a few words that made Sandra's whole body go still. "I thought I lost you." Her heart ached. "You didn't lose me, I just needed time. I needed space to think." He shook his head weakly. "I know, but I couldn't stay away anymore. I couldn't stay silent, not after what happened. Not after the way you walked away from me on set. I should have stopped you. I should have told you the truth before it hurt both of us." The truth, the word hit her like a wave. She helped him into the cabin, closing the door behind them. The warmth of the room wrapped around them, but Sandra could feel Keanu shaking as if the cold had reached deep inside him. She made him sit near the fire and placed a blanket around his shoulders. He watched her with tired eyes, like he was afraid she would disappear if he blinked. "Keanu," she whispered, "why did you come here in a storm like this? You could have been hurt." He lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly. "I had to see you. I had to say what I should have said years ago. I had to tell you why I reacted the way I did that day. I had to explain everything before I lost the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore." Sandra sat across from him, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She knew this moment was building for a long time, even if she had tried to push it away. Every look, every small moment they shared, every unspoken word, they had all led to this night. Keanu took a shaky breath. "I came because I can't keep pretending. I can't keep hiding the real reason I pushed you away. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't even fear." His voice broke slightly, and Sandra leaned closer without realizing it. "Then what was it?" she whispered. He looked up at her with eyes so full of emotion that she felt her own breath tremble. "It was because I care too much," he whispered, "and I didn't know how to tell you without ruining everything." Sandra felt her chest tighten painfully. She wanted to speak, but the words tangled inside her. Keanu's voice turned softer, almost pleading. "I came here to tell you the truth, the real truth, but before I say it, I need to know one thing." Sandra swallowed hard. "What thing?" He held her gaze with a fragile strength. "If I tell you what I've been hiding, will you stay and listen, or will you walk away again?" The snow outside pressed against the windows, the fire crackled softly, and the entire cabin felt suspended in a moment that could break or heal everything between them. Sandra opened her mouth to answer. But suddenly the lights flickered violently, the storm roared louder, and the power cut out completely, throwing the cabin into darkness. Keanu whispered her name again, this time not in fear of losing her in the snow, but in fear of losing her to the truth he was finally ready to reveal. The truth Keanu carried through the storm. Darkness swallowed the cabin so completely that for a moment Sandra felt as if the world had disappeared around them. The sudden silence after the power cut left her heart beating too loudly, echoing in her ears while the storm raged against the windows like something alive. She could barely see Keanu, but she felt him shift closer, his breathing uneven, his voice soft as he whispered her name to make sure she was still near him. The fire still glowed faintly, giving off just enough light to shape the outline of his face, and in that dim glow she saw something that tightened her chest even more, fear, but not the kind caused by the storm. It was a deeper fear, one that came from the inside, from long years of silence, regrets, and unspoken truth. Sandra moved closer to him without thinking, guided by instinct more than sight. Her hand brushed against his, and he gasped quietly, as if the simple touch was enough to shake him. She realized then just how cold he still was, how exhausted and tense his body felt beneath the blanket. She wondered how long he had been walking through the snow before she heard him calling her name. She wondered what thoughts had pushed him forward in that freezing darkness. But more than anything, she wondered what truth he had been too afraid to say until tonight. "Keanu, I'm here," she whispered, her voice steady even though she felt anything but steady inside. "I won't leave, not this time." He let out a shaky breath, and the sound told her more than any words could. He had been holding himself together for so long that he didn't know how to let go. Yet now, sitting across from her in the dim firelight, he looked like a man who had finally reached the moment he could no longer run from. "I didn't come here because of the argument," he whispered. "I didn't come because of the tension on set or the interviews or the pressure. I came because something inside me finally broke when you walked away that day. I thought I was protecting both of us by staying silent, but I realized I was only hurting us more." Sandra felt her breath tremble. She remembered that day clearly, the way she had turned away from him even though her heart felt heavy, the confusion in his eyes, the way her own emotions were too tangled to face. She had convinced herself that distance would help, but being alone in the cabin, these past nights had only shown her how much of herself she had been trying to hide. "What broke?" she asked softly. Keanu looked into the fire, the glow reflecting in his eyes like memories he had buried too deep. "The part of me that thought I didn't deserve to ask for anything more than friendship. The part that told me I should keep my feelings to myself because if I opened up, I would only complicate your life. I've lost people before, Sandra. I know what it feels like to have something precious slip away because you were too afraid to fight for it. I didn't want that with you. But by trying to avoid losing you, I ended up pushing you away instead." Sandra's heart twisted painfully. She wanted to tell him she understood. She wanted to tell him she had felt something too, something she didn't know how to handle. But the words stayed caught in her throat, heavy and uncertain. Keanu inhaled deeply, gathering whatever strength he needed to continue. The truth I wanted to tell you, it's something I've carried for years, something I always tried to push down because life kept taking unexpected turns and timing never felt right. But when I saw you walk away from me that day, something inside me felt like it was collapsing. I realized that staying silent was no longer an option. He turned toward her fully then, his voice soft but steady, a kind of vulnerability she had never heard from him before. The truth is, I never stopped caring about you, not once, not in all these years. The words hit her like a warm wave and a cold shock at the same time. She felt her breath catch, her pulse quicken, and something inside her that had been quietly aching for years finally wake up. She looked at him with wide, stunned eyes, unsure how to respond. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them with a warmth that felt almost symbolic, as if the universe itself was holding space for this moment. Keanu continued before she could speak, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't know how to tell you because I didn't want to make you uncomfortable. I didn't want you to feel pressured. I didn't want our friendship to suffer because it has always meant more to me than I ever said out loud. You have been one of the most important people in my life, even in the quiet years when we weren't working together. I thought keeping my feelings hidden would protect what we had, but instead, I ended up creating distance that neither of us deserved. Sandra felt tears sting her eyes, warm and unexpected. She blinked them away, but they kept forming because his honesty was breaking something open inside her, something she had tried to lock away. She took a slow breath, trying to keep her voice steady. Keanu, why didn't you tell me earlier? He lowered his eyes. Fear, not of you, never of you, but of what my truth would do to your life. You have always carried so much with grace. I didn't want to add my complicated feelings to your world, and every time I thought timing was right, something happened. Your life changed, my life changed, the world changed. So I convinced myself that silence was the respectful choice. But silence became a wall, and that wall pushed you away that day. Sandra reached out slowly, placing her hand over his. She felt him freeze for a second, then slowly relax beneath her touch, as if her hand alone was enough to remind him he was not alone. Keanu, she whispered, I wasn't walking away from you. I was walking away from my own confusion. I didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. I thought distance would make everything clear, but instead it just made everything heavier. I just needed time, not separation. He looked up at her with eyes full of emotion, and she saw something there she had never truly acknowledged before, love, quiet and steady, the kind that didn't demand attention but lived in every small gesture, every thoughtful moment, every shared silence. Before she could say anything more, the storm outside suddenly intensified, shaking the windows so hard that both of them turned toward the sound. The wind roared like something furious, and snow slammed against the cabin walls with relentless force. The temperature inside seemed to drop slightly, and Sandra felt a chill crawl up her arms. Keanu stood up, trying to look outside despite the darkness. This storm is getting worse, he said quietly. I've seen storms in the mountains before, but this is different. It's stronger, unpredictable. I'm worried the road might be blocked. We might be stuck here for a while. Sandra felt a ripple of anxiety, but also a strange sense of safety. Being stuck in a cabin during a dangerous storm should have filled her with fear, but instead she felt something else, a sense of closeness, of delayed conversations finally finding their moment. Then we stay here until it passes, she said softly. We're safe as long as we're inside. Keanu turned back to her, and for the first time that night, a faint, tired smile touched his face. Thank you, he whispered, for letting me in, literally and emotionally. She returned a gentle smile, though her heart still raced with everything unsaid between them. They sat again near the fire, closer this time, wrapped in warmth and flickering shadows. The storm outside made the world disappear, and inside the small cabin it felt as if time had slowed down just for them. Sandra finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. Keanu, there's something I need to admit too. He looked at her, focused and open, waiting for her to continue. She took a deep breath. I didn't come here to escape from you. I came here because being around you was becoming so overwhelming that I didn't know how to handle it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. I was afraid of how much you mattered to me without me even realizing it. Keanu's eyes softened in a way that made her heart throb. Sandra. I thought if I stepped back, things would become clear, she continued. But instead, every quiet moment made me think of you more. Every silence made me feel your absence. I didn't push you away because I wanted distance. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to face what I was feeling. Keanu leaned slightly closer, his voice gentle. And what are you feeling? She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, a loud cracking sound echoed from outside, sharp and sudden, like a tree splitting under the weight of heavy snow. The cabin shook slightly, and Sandra gasped as the lights flickered again even though the power was already out. Keanu stood up quickly, his protective instincts kicking in. "Stay here," he said softly. "I need to check something." Sandra grabbed his arm. "Keanu, wait, what if something is wrong out there?" He turned back to her, squeezing her hand gently. "I won't go far. I just need to make sure the roof and the porch aren't damaged. I'll be right back, I promise." Her heart pounded, but she nodded. Keanu stepped toward the door, opening it just enough to look outside. And then Sandra heard him suck in a sharp breath. "Sandra," he whispered, his voice suddenly tight with alarm, "you need to see this." She stood walking toward him, her stomach tightening with fear. She reached the doorway, looked outside, and froze. Something was out there in the snow, and it was moving toward the cabin, the figure in the snow. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the swirling white darkness outside the cabin. The snow was falling so heavily that everything beyond a few feet looked blurred, as if the world were dissolving into cold mist. But even through that heavy curtain of white, she saw it clearly, something moving toward them, slow and uneven, as if struggling against the storm. For a moment, she couldn't tell if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely. All she knew was that it shouldn't have been there. No one should have been out in a storm like this. The roads were blocked, the weather warnings had been strict, and the cabin was far from any nearby homes. The sight of a figure approaching in such violent weather felt unreal, almost like a scene pulled from a memory or a dream she hadn't meant to have. Keanu stepped in front of her slightly, as if his body could shield her from whatever was coming. He squinted into the distance, trying to make sense of the shape moving toward them. Snowflakes stuck to his eyelashes, melting into small drops on his cheeks. The icy wind blew his hair back, and Sandra felt her heart tighten at the thought of him going back into that storm again. He had already risked enough just to reach her. She placed a hand on his arm, not to stop him, but to stay connected to him, to remind herself that he was real, and that she wasn't alone. "Do you think it's a person?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," he replied softly, "but whatever it is, it's coming straight toward the cabin." Her stomach twisted. She instinctively stepped closer to Keanu, her shoulder brushing against his. He didn't move away. Instead, he glanced at her with a protective softness in his eyes before turning back to the storm. The figure grew clearer as it approached. Through the thick snow, Sandra began to make out the outline of someone hunched over, holding their arms close to their body. Their steps were uneven, almost dragging, as if they were exhausted or hurt. The sight made something inside her ache with worry, but a part of her also felt a flicker of fear. People didn't just appear in the middle of nowhere during dangerous storms. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. "Should we help them?" Sandra asked, though part of her already knew her heart would not let her turn away from someone in need. Keanu hesitated for a moment, torn between caution and compassion. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, if someone is out there, they won't survive long, but we have to be careful." They moved closer to the doorway together, Sandra gripping the edge of the wall as the wind pushed cold air into the cabin. The figure stumbled again, nearly falling into the deep snow, and Sandra gasped as she took a single step outside. Keanu gently held her back. "Let me go first," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with concern. "Stay behind me." She wanted to argue, but she understood his need to protect her. So she nodded, though her heart thudded wildly against her ribs. Keanu stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Sandra stayed right behind him, refusing to let him out of her sight. The wind whipped around them, freezing the tips of her fingers even through her coat. She hugged herself tightly, watching the approaching figure with wide, anxious eyes. When the figure finally came close enough, Sandra let out a soft cry, because she could see now that it was a person. A man, and he looked like he was seconds away from collapsing. Keanu hurried toward him, catching his arm just as the man fell forward into the snow. Sandra rushed to help, her hands shaking as she touched the man's freezing shoulder. His clothes were soaked, his hair covered in ice, and his breath came out in shallow, desperate gasps. He looked older, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with deep lines etched into his face, the kind of lines that were shaped not only by age but by long years of worry. "Please," the man whispered, his voice so faint Sandra barely heard it. "Help, please." His body went limp in Keanu's arms. "We have to get him inside now," Keanu said urgently. Sandra nodded quickly. Together they lifted the man, supporting his weight as best as they could while struggling against the storm. Snow piled around their legs as they moved, making every step harder. Sandra's breath came out harsh and uneven, more from anxiety than effort, but she didn't slow down. Once they reached the cabin, Keanu gently laid the man near the fireplace, pulling off his wet scarf and coat while Sandra hurried to grab blankets. The firelight revealed more of the man's face, pale, exhausted, with eyes filled with a mixture of pain and fear. Sandra wrapped him carefully, her hands trembling as she tucked the blankets around his shoulders. "Sir," she whispered softly, "you're safe now, you're inside, it's warm, can you hear me?" The man blinked slowly, his eyes focusing on Sandra as if he recognized something in her face, something familiar. His lips parted and Sandra leaned in to listen. "Your cabin, your lights, I saw them. I thought I wouldn't make it." Keanu crouched beside him, speaking gently. "You're going to be all right. You're safe here. Can you tell us what happened? Why were you out in this storm alone?" The man swallowed weakly, his expression clouded with something deeper than cold or exhaustion. I wasn't alone," he whispered, his breath shaky. "There were others, we were on the road. Car slipped, hit a tree. I got thrown out. The others, I don't know if they're alive. I tried to go back, but the snow was too heavy." Sandra's eyes widened. "Others, how many?" "Two, maybe three," the man breathed. "I couldn't see, everything happened so fast." Keanu exchanged a tense look with Sandra. She felt her heart tighten painfully. The storm had already been dangerous, and now there were possibly injured people out there with no shelter. The thought made her stomach twist with dread. "We have to call for help," Sandra said quickly. "The power is out," Keanu reminded her quietly, "and the signal here is weak even on good days." She checked her phone anyway, no service. A wave of helplessness washed over her. The man reached for Keanu's hand, gripping it weakly. "Please, you have to help them. They won't survive out there. The car is somewhere down the road, I don't know how far. Everything looks the same in the snow." Keanu nodded, his face serious. "I'll go." Sandra's head snapped up. "Keanu, no, you can't go back out there, it's too dangerous." "We can't leave people out there to freeze," he said gently but firmly. "If it were us, we'd want someone to try." "I know that," she whispered desperately, "but you barely made it here yourself. If you go back into that storm, you might not come back." Keanu reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch cut through her fear, but not enough to silence it. "I'll be careful. I won't go far. If the road is blocked or visibility is too low, I'll come back immediately. But we can't ignore the possibility that someone needs us." Sandra searched his eyes, her own filling with fear. She knew he was right. She knew she would never forgive herself if people died while she stayed inside doing nothing. But the idea of Keanu walking into that storm again made her chest ache so intensely she could hardly breathe. "Let me come with you," she said. He shook his head immediately. "No, it's too dangerous." "Keanu, I'm not letting you go out there alone." The man on the floor coughed weakly, reminding them that time was not something they had. Sandra looked at him, then back at Keanu, her heart torn. "Please," she whispered, "don't shut me out, not now, we face this together." Keanu looked at her for a long second, and she could see the battle inside him, his instinct to protect her, his fear of losing her, and his understanding that she would rather stand beside him in danger than stay behind in fear. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right," he whispered, "but we stay close. We don't separate, and at the first sign of trouble, we turn back, no arguments." She nodded, relief and fear mixing inside her like a storm of its own. Sandra grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, testing it to make sure it worked. Keanu put on his coat, tightening the collar around his neck. He looked back at her as she slipped into her boots, her hands shaking slightly. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. She took a deep breath. "No, but I'm going anyway." He gave her a small, soft smile, the kind that reached his eyes even in the dim light. "Then we go together." They stepped outside into the storm, the wind hitting them like a wall of ice. The snow was deep, almost to their knees, and visibility was barely more than a few feet. Sandra gripped Keanu's arm tightly, and he kept his other hand wrapped around hers, grounding them both. The world outside felt endless and unforgiving, a white wilderness that swallowed sound and direction. But they kept moving, following the faint outline of the road, guided only by Keanu's memory and Sandra's unwavering determination. After several minutes, Sandra saw something through the storm, a dark shape half buried in the snow. "Keanu," she whispered, pointing, "is that?" "The car," he said, his voice tightening. They moved closer, their hearts pounding. Sandra felt her breath freeze in her chest as the shape became clearer. It was the crashed car. But that wasn't what made her stop in her tracks. It was what she saw beside it. A second set of footprints in the snow. Fresh ones, leading away from the car. And not toward the cabin, but deeper into the woods. Keanu, Sandra whispered, her voice breaking. Someone else was here and they're still out there. Keanu lifted the flashlight slowly, following the footprints into the darkness of the trees. Then he said words that made Sandra's blood run cold. These footprints, they're small, too small for an adult. Her heart froze. Someone out there was a child, and they were alone in the storm, the child in the storm. World around them felt suddenly sharper and colder, as if the storm itself had heard Keanu's words and tightened its grip on the mountains. Sandra stared at the small footprints disappearing into the dark line of trees, and her breath turned thin and shaky, drifting into the night like fragile smoke. The snowflakes seemed to fall faster, thicker, as if trying to erase the tracks before they could follow them. Something inside her twisted painfully, a fierce instinct rising from a place she had never questioned. A child was out there alone in this brutal storm, wandering deeper into the freezing woods, and every second they hesitated made the danger worse. Keanu saw the fear in her eyes and gently squeezed her hand. The gesture said everything. They would face this together even if the storm tried to tear them apart. He lifted the flashlight, directing its narrow beam toward the trail. The small footprints were uneven, sometimes close together, sometimes far apart, as if whoever made them had been stumbling, running, or perhaps desperately searching for someone. "We have to find them before the snow covers the path," Sandra whispered, her voice trembling. "We will," Keanu said softly, though she could hear the worry in his voice. "We just have to stay calm and follow the tracks while we still can." They started walking, each step sinking deep into the thick snow. The wind pushed against them, howling through the dark pines like a warning. Sandra pulled her hood tighter around her face, but the cold still found a way to bite through every layer. Keanu kept his arm firmly linked with hers, making sure she never lost her balance. Even in the middle of fear and chaos, his presence felt grounding, steady, like an anchor in the storm. As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew taller and the darkness thicker. Their flashlight beam flickered against branches heavy with snow, and every shadow looked like something hiding. The footprints became harder to see, drifting under the quickly falling snow. Sandra's heart raced each time one of the prints disappeared completely, but Keanu would always find the next one a few feet ahead, guiding them forward with quiet determination. After several minutes, Sandra's breath grew uneven. "Keanu, do you think the child was trying to find help?" "Maybe," he answered softly. "Or maybe they were scared and ran from the car after the crash. Sometimes panic makes people run without thinking." "But they're alone out here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "In this cold, what if?" Keanu stopped walking and turned to her, placing both of his hands on her arms. His eyes, even in the dim light, were full of something steady and reassuring. "We can't think the worst," he said gently. "We just keep moving, that child needs us, and we're going to find them." She nodded, swallowing the fear that had risen in her throat. Keanu was right. Panic would help no one. They had to stay focused, step by step, print by print. They continued through the woods, their bodies shaking from the cold. The wind seemed to come from every direction at once, making Sandra lean into Keanu for warmth and balance. He held her close, protecting her from the harshest gusts. Even in the middle of chaos, his instinct to shield her did not falter. After a long stretch of silence broken only by the storm, the footprints suddenly changed direction. Instead of wandering deeper into the forest, they curved sharply toward a cluster of fallen trees, partly covered by snow. Keanu lifted the flashlight higher, revealing what looked like a small hollow space between two massive trunks. "Sandra," he whispered, "look there." She held her breath as she stared at the dark space. Something inside it moved, small, slow, and barely visible. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Is that—" Keanu stepped forward first, moving carefully across the uneven snow. Sandra followed, her heart pounding as she approached the hollow. When Keanu lowered the flashlight into the space, Sandra felt her entire body tense. There, curled up against the base of the fallen tree, was a small child, a boy maybe 7 or 8 years old. His clothes were soaked from the snow, his hair frozen in thin strands against his forehead. He was shivering violently, his lips pale and trembling. His eyes, wide and frightened, reflected the flashlight beam like tiny glass marbles. Sandra's heart broke instantly. "Sweetheart," she whispered gently, kneeling beside him. Hey, it's okay. We're here to help you." The boy blinked slowly, as if trying to process her voice through the fog of cold and fear. Keanu crouched on the other side of him, speaking softly. "You're safe now," he said, his tone warm and calm. "We're going to take you somewhere warm." At the sound of Keanu's voice, the boy's breath hitched. His small hands gripped the snow weakly, his fingers stiff from the cold. Sandra reached out slowly so she wouldn't startle him and touched his shoulder. The coldness of his body made her gasp. "He's freezing," she whispered. "Keanu, we have to get him back to the cabin fast." Keanu nodded. "We will. Let's wrap him in your scarf first. We need to warm him as much as we can before moving him." Sandra removed her scarf without hesitation, wrapping it carefully around the boy's small shoulders. His body shook harder at the sudden touch, but when he looked at her, something in his eyes softened slightly, some tiny spark of trust flickering to life. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Sandra asked gently. The boy struggled to speak, his voice barely a whisper. Milo." "Hi, Milo," she said softly. "I'm Sandra, this is Keanu. We're going to take care of you, okay?" Milo glanced at Keanu, his lips trembling as he tried to speak again. My mom, my dad, they were in the car. Are they okay?" Sandra felt her throat tighten painfully. She looked at Keanu, and he gave her a soft, steady nod, a signal for her to speak with kindness and honesty. "We found someone from the car," she said gently. "He's safe now and inside where it's warm. We're going to look for everyone else too. But first we need to get you somewhere safe so you don't get any colder." Milo nodded weakly, tears mixing with the snow on his cheeks. Sandra wiped them away gently, her heart aching at the sight. Keanu reached under Milo's arms, moving slowly and carefully. "I'm going to lift you now, okay? I'll hold you tight. You're not going to fall." Milo nodded again, trusting him even through his pain and fear. When Keanu lifted him, the boy let out a small cry from the cold, and Sandra immediately wrapped her coat around him from the side, holding part of his weight. They shared the burden step by step, shielding him from the wind and snow. The walk back to the cabin felt infinitely longer than the walk out. The storm seemed angrier now, pushing harder against them as if trying to pull Milo from their arms. Sandra pressed closer to Keanu, helping him keep balance while keeping Milo warm against her chest. Every time Milo whimpered from the cold, Sandra whispered soft, soothing words, and Keanu squeezed her shoulder gently to keep her steady. By the time they reached the cabin, Sandra was shaking so hard she could barely feel her fingers. Keanu pushed the door open with his shoulder, letting warm air spill out toward them. They hurried inside, closing the door behind them as fast as they could. The man they had rescued earlier looked up from the blankets near the fire, his eyes widening when he saw Milo. Sandra could see the fear and relief collide in his expression. "Milo," the man gasped, his voice breaking as he tried to sit up. "Oh God, Milo." Milo lifted his head slightly. "Grandpa." Sandra felt a wave of relief wash through her. At least now they knew the boy wasn't alone in the world. Keanu gently placed Milo near the fire, helping Sandra remove the soaked layers from the boy's arms and legs. They wrapped him in dry blankets, rubbing his hands carefully to bring warmth back. Milo shivered violently at first, then slowly began to relax as the heat seeped into his frozen limbs. The man, Milo's grandfather, reached out weakly. Thank you both. I thought he was gone." Sandra knelt beside him, placing a warm hand over his. "He's safe now. We found him in the woods, but he's here. He's with you." Tears ran down the man's face, and he bowed his head in relief. Keanu checked Milo's breathing, making sure it was steady. "He needs something warm to drink," he murmured. "Once he's stable, we'll try to check the road again. Maybe there's a chance his parents are still." He stopped when he noticed Sandra's expression. She was staring at Milo, her eyes wide, her face pale with shock. "Sandra," Keanu whispered, moving closer. "What is it?" She looked at him, struggling to speak. "Keanu, look at his wrist." Keanu turned the flashlight toward Milo's small arm. The boy had a bracelet made of thin, braided string. A bracelet that looked impossibly familiar. Keanu's breath stopped. Sandra whispered, her voice trembling. "Keanu, that's the exact bracelet you gave away years ago. The one you said only one person ever took from you." Keanu's face drained of color. Because he had only given that bracelet to one person. A woman who disappeared from his life without a trace. Milo's mother, the truth buried in the snow. Keanu stared at the thin braided bracelet around Milo's wrist as if the world had suddenly narrowed to a single point in front of him. The fire crackled softly behind them, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls, but the warmth no longer touched Keanu. He felt frozen in a different way than the storm had frozen him earlier. This was the cold of recognition, of memory, of disbelief fighting with something deeper, something painful. His breath caught in his throat, and he took an involuntary step closer to the boy, though his hands trembled as he knelt. Sandra felt her chest tighten as she watched him. She had never seen his face look like that, pale, stunned, shaken to the core. She knew the story of that bracelet, not in detail, but enough to understand how much it meant. She remembered the long night years ago when he had told her about it in a quiet moment on set, speaking in a soft, broken way that made her heart ache. He had given that bracelet to someone he cared about deeply, someone who had disappeared from his life so suddenly that it left him scarred for years. He had never expected to see it again. Yet here it was, wrapped around the wrist of a freezing child they found in the woods. Keanu's voice was barely a whisper. "Where did you get that bracelet?" Milo looked at him with sleepy, confused eyes, still recovering from the cold. The little boy's voice trembled when he spoke. "My mom gave it to me. She said it was lucky. She said I should never lose it." Keanu swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Your mom, what's her name?" Milo hesitated for a moment, glancing toward his grandfather before answering. "Her name is Leela." The room fell silent. Sandra gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Keanu's heart felt like it had stopped beating. He whispered the name again, as if saying it might make it more real. "Leela." Milo nodded weakly. "Yeah, Leela Reeves." The sound of that last name tore something open inside Keanu so violently that he had to steady himself on the floor. Sandra reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand on his back, grounding him so he didn't fall under the weight of the moment. Leela Reeves. His sister, or rather the girl who had been like a sister to him, the one he had met when they were young, whose last name he had carried in secret memory because she had refused to use her real family name. She had disappeared years ago without explanation. He had searched for her, tried to contact her, even traced old addresses, but she had cut contact entirely. He had assumed she wanted to leave her old life behind. He had assumed she was alive, somewhere in the world, choosing anonymity. He never imagined this. Never imagined finding a child, wearing the bracelet he had given her when they were only teenagers. Sandra knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Keanu, breathe, it's okay, I'm right here." Her presence steadied him, and he finally found his voice, though it trembled. "Milo, where is your mom now?" Milo's eyes filled with tears, and he looked at his grandfather. The old man exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. "She was driving us. We were going to the town hospital. She told me she wasn't feeling well, but she wanted to get there before things got worse. And then the car slipped on the ice, crashed into a tree. When I woke up, she was gone. I thought maybe she went to find help, but—" Keanu felt his breath collapse inward. "She was in the car with you," he whispered. The grandfather nodded slowly. "Yes, she was." Sandra felt a chill travel down her spine that had nothing to do with the storm. Milo had said she gave him the bracelet. She had disappeared from the crash site, and now she was missing somewhere in the storm, possibly injured, possibly alone, possibly. "Keanu," Sandra whispered, her voice cracking, "we have to find her right now." Keanu rose to his feet so suddenly that the blanket around him slipped onto the floor. The grief, fear, and determination in his eyes struck Sandra like a physical force. She had seen Keanu emotional before, but this was different. This was a mixture of heartbreak and desperate hope. "We're going," he said, his voice raw with urgency. But before he reached the door, Sandra stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Wait, you can't run back into that storm without thinking. You already almost collapsed when you got here, and going alone is too dangerous." "I'm not staying here while she's out there," Keanu said, his voice low and shaking. "I've already lost her once. I won't lose her again, not tonight, not like this." Sandra placed both hands on his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're not going alone, you hear me, we go together." Keanu shook his head weakly. "I can't drag you into this, it's too dangerous, if anything happened to you." "Stop," she whispered firmly, her voice gentle but unyielding. "I'm not letting you walk into that storm by yourself, not when you're hurting like this, not when someone you love is missing. We're in this together, Keanu, remember." He stared at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. Her voice, her touch, her presence, all of it anchored him enough to keep him from breaking apart. He closed his eyes briefly, leaning into her hands, breathing in deeply to steady himself. When he opened them again, his voice was softer. "Thank you." She nodded gently, "Always." The grandfather struggled to sit up, wincing from the pain in his ribs. "Please," he begged, his voice weak but desperate, "find my daughter. She wouldn't leave Milo on purpose. She must be hurt." Milo reached out toward them, his small voice trembling. "Please find my mom. Please bring her back." Keanu knelt beside the boy and took his hand. "I promise," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm going to find her no matter what." Tears gathered in Milo's eyes, and he nodded weakly, trusting him. Sandra wrapped another blanket around the boy and checked his temperature. He was warming slowly, but he was still fragile. They didn't have the luxury of time. She grabbed a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and an extra blanket. Keanu put on a heavier coat and gloves, his expression focused and fierce. The storm was still raging outside, but there was no hesitation left in either of them. When they opened the door, the wind slammed into them again, harder than before. It felt like the mountain itself was trying to push them back. But Keanu leaned into the storm, and Sandra leaned into him, the two of them pressing forward into the snow. The night swallowed them almost immediately. Their flashlight illuminated only a small space ahead, and the snowflakes looked like thousands of tiny shards swirling in every direction. Sandra gripped Keanu's arm tightly, and he kept his hand over hers, guiding her through the deep drifts. They walked back toward the crash site, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. When they reached the mangled car, Keanu felt his stomach twist painfully. Pieces of glass were half buried in snow, the front of the car dented inward, branches scattered across the hood. The driver's door was open, hanging crooked. "She got out," Sandra whispered, her voice barely audible. Keanu nodded, scanning the area desperately. But where did she go? Sandra shined her flashlight around the car, trying to piece together the trail. Suddenly, she noticed something half buried in the snow, just a few feet away. A glove. A small, delicate glove. Sandra picked it up carefully, dusting off the snow. "Keanu, this must be hers." His breath trembled. They moved the flashlight farther ahead, and then Sandra saw it. Footprints. Faint, scattered, and partially erased by the storm, but still visible. Leading away from the car. But not toward the cabin. The tracks went uphill, toward the darker, steeper part of the forest. "She was trying to climb," Keanu whispered in disbelief. "Why would she go up there?" Sandra thought quickly. Maybe she saw a light, maybe she thought help was in that direction, or maybe she was disoriented after the crash. Keanu clenched his jaw, fighting the panic rising inside him. "We have to follow the tracks before the snow covers them completely." They began climbing, step by step, slipping on patches of ice, pushing through branches weighed down by snow. The wind cut at their faces, and Sandra leaned on Keanu for balance, her legs trembling from the cold. He held her hand tightly, refusing to let her fall. The footprints grew harder to follow, appearing in broken pieces. Sometimes they found one, sometimes they lost the trail entirely. Each time they lost it, Keanu's breath would quicken, his heart racing, until Sandra pointed out another faint imprint up ahead. After climbing for several minutes, they reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The storm felt slightly quieter here, as if the trees were shielding them from the worst of it. Sandra shined her flashlight across the snow. And froze. "Keanu," she whispered. His head snapped toward her voice. "What is it?" She pointed to the ground. There, in the center of the clearing, was a long, fresh drag mark in the snow, as if something heavy had been pulled across it. Or someone. Keanu's breath collapsed into a single broken whisper. "Leela." They followed the drag mark with frantic urgency, moving deeper into the clearing, until the beam of Sandra's flashlight landed on something ahead. A dark shape. Still, silent, half buried in the snow. Keanu's voice broke into a raw cry. "Leela." He surged forward, but Sandra grabbed his arm with both hands, stopping him just inches before he reached the still figure. Because something else moved behind the trees. A shadow, standing, watching them. And it wasn't Leela. The night the storm revealed everything. Keanu froze in place as the shadow shifted behind the trees. Sandra felt his muscles tense beneath her hands, the fear and urgency inside him rising like a storm of its own. The dark figure stood perfectly still, almost blending into the forest as snow drifted around it. Sandra's breath caught as she tightened her grip on Keanu's arm, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the wind anymore. She didn't know whether the shadow was a person, an animal, or something else entirely, but the way it moved, slow, deliberate, aware, made her skin crawl. For a moment, the forest felt alive in a way that didn't belong to the world they knew. The snow-covered branches creaked softly, and the darkness between the trees felt deeper than before, as if something was watching them not just from one point, but from everywhere at once. Keanu took a slow step forward, his breath shaking, but Sandra pulled him back again. "Keanu, wait," she whispered urgently. "We don't know who that is." Keanu looked at her with desperation burning in his eyes. "Sandra, Leela is right there. I can't leave her." She glanced at the still figure half buried in the snow, the one they had thought was Leela. The drag marks led straight to it, but Sandra noticed something strange now that she hadn't seen before. The shape was too stiff, too still, too quiet. Something about it didn't feel alive. "Keanu," she whispered carefully. "We don't know if that's her yet. Please just wait 1 second." The shadow behind the trees shifted again. Then it stepped forward, and Sandra felt her breath stop completely. It was a person, but not Leela. When the figure finally entered the beam of the flashlight, Sandra saw an older woman, wrapped in a heavy winter coat, her face pale with fear and exhaustion. Her hair was damp and tangled, and her eyes darted between Keanu and Sandra like she wasn't sure whether to run or collapse. She raised her hands slowly, her voice breaking. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you." Keanu felt confusion wash through him, sharp and sudden. Sandra lowered her flashlight slightly but didn't let go of Keanu. "Who are you?" Sandra whispered, her voice trembling. The woman swallowed hard, tears forming in her eyes. "My name is Mara," she whispered. I saw the crash earlier tonight. I was nearby, I tried to help, but the storm was too strong, everything happened so fast. I saw someone, a woman, she crawled out of the car before I could reach her. She was hurt, bleeding, confused. She kept calling out for someone named Milo. I tried to bring her somewhere safe." Keanu felt his knees weaken. "Where is she?" he choked out. "Is she alive?" Mara wiped tears from her frozen cheeks, her breath catching in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "She's alive, she's unconscious, but she's breathing." Sandra felt tears of relief fill her eyes, but Keanu didn't move. He stood frozen, trembling, as if his body couldn't decide between collapsing and running. Mara stepped aside and pointed shakily to a small shelter she had built between the trees, hidden under branches and a fallen trunk. "She's in there," she said softly. "I kept her covered with everything I had, but the storm kept getting worse. I didn't know if anyone was coming. I didn't know if I could move her alone." Keanu didn't wait another second. He ran. Sandra followed, her legs shaking, her heart beating so fast she felt dizzy. The shelter was small, barely large enough for one person, but it shielded the figure inside from the worst of the storm. Keanu fell to his knees beside the still body, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he brushed snow from her hair. "Leela," he whispered, his voice breaking apart. "Oh God, Leela." Sandra knelt beside him, her breath trembling. Mara stood behind them, her hands over her mouth, watching with equal parts fear and relief. Keanu gently turned Leela toward him, brushing snow from her eyelashes. Her face was pale, but her breathing was faintly visible, tiny clouds of warm air drifting into the cold night. Sandra felt her chest loosen for the first time since they had left the cabin. "She's alive," Sandra whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Keanu, she's alive." Keanu leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Years of grief, worry, confusion, and longing surged through him all at once. He held her hand, warming her cold fingers with his own, whispering her name over and over as if he could bring her back with his voice alone. After a long moment, Sandra placed a gentle hand on his back. "We have to get her to the cabin," she said softly. "She needs warmth and help." Keanu lifted his head, wiping his tears with the back of his glove. "You're right," he whispered, steadying himself. Mara stepped forward. "I'll help you carry her," she said with quiet determination. Together, the three of them lifted Leela carefully, wrapping her in the extra blanket Sandra had carried. Keanu held most of her weight, refusing to let go, his strength fueled by fear and love. Sandra walked beside him, steadying his steps, brushing snow from Leela's face whenever it gathered. The journey back to the cabin felt endless. The wind pushed against them with violent force, and Keanu stumbled once, nearly falling. Sandra caught his arm, refusing to let him collapse. Myra walked close behind, shielding them from the harshest gusts with her coat. When the cabin finally came into view, Sandra exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Inside, the warmth hit their frozen skin instantly. Milo gasped when he saw the woman they were carrying, his small voice breaking into a cry. "Mom!" Keanu gently placed Leela on the floor near the fire. Sandra rushed to check her pulse again. It was stronger now, but still fragile. Milo crawled toward her, holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, please wake up." The grandfather sobbed quietly behind him, unable to move from his spot but watching with aching hope. Keanu knelt beside Leela, brushing her hair gently. "Leela, it's me," he whispered. "I'm here, you're safe now." Slowly, painfully slowly, Leela's eyes fluttered. The small room fell silent. She blinked once, trying to focus. Her gaze drifted toward the light, then toward Sandra, then toward Milo, and finally it reached Keanu. Her lips parted. "Keanu," she whispered, her voice fragile and cracked with cold. Keanu let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "I'm here," he whispered, tears running freely down his face. "I'm here, Leela, you're okay, you're safe." Leela's eyes filled with tears. "Milo, is he?" "He's safe," Keanu said, his voice gentle and full of love. "He's right here." Milo threw himself into her arms, sobbing into her coat. Leela held him tightly despite her weakness, whispering his name over and over. Sandra felt her heart swell and ache at the same time. She wiped her eyes quietly, overwhelmed by the warmth and humanity of the moment. Mara stood back, her face soft with relief, her eyes shining with tears. Keanu turned to Sandra, his expression soft and full of gratitude so deep that it reached into her own heart. "Thank you," he whispered. "I couldn't have done this without you." Sandra shook her head gently, wiping her tears. "We did it together." The storm outside began to quiet, the howling wind becoming a soft whisper against the cabin walls. Inside, warmth grew, not just from the fire but from the reunion unfolding before them, fragile, emotional, and beautiful. Leela leaned weakly against the blankets, still dizzy but conscious. She looked at Keanu for a long moment, the weight of years filling her gaze. "I never meant to disappear," she whispered. "I was scared, overwhelmed, life pulled me away in ways I couldn't control." Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't have to explain tonight. You're here, that's what matters." Leela nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes. After a long silence, she looked at Sandra and whispered softly, "Thank you for helping them, for helping him." Sandra smiled warmly. "I'm just glad you're safe." Keanu reached for Sandra's hand then, squeezing it gently. She looked at him, their eyes meeting in a way that spoke more than words could. Through fear, storms, heartbreak, confusion, and hope, they had found each other too. The night had shown them the truth. Their connection wasn't fragile. It wasn't imagined. It was real, strong, and born from the deepest parts of their hearts. Later, when Leela was wrapped in warm blankets and slowly drifting into safe rest, and Milo fell asleep beside her holding her hand, Sandra and Keanu stepped outside for a moment. The storm had finally calmed. The sky glowed with the faint silver light of early morning, and snowflakes drifted slowly, peacefully, like feathers falling from a quiet sky. Keanu took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Then he looked at Sandra, his eyes soft and warm. "I thought I lost everything tonight," he whispered. "But instead, I found the truth. I found my family, and I almost lost the chance to tell you what you mean to me." Sandra stepped closer, their breath mingling in the cold air. "We're here," she whispered. "We made it through the storm." He smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried gratitude, relief, and something deeper, something tender. "Sandra," he whispered, "after tonight, after everything, I can't pretend anymore. I care about you more than I ever let myself admit." Her heart trembled, but in a warm way. She touched his cheek gently. "I know," she whispered, "and I care about you too, I always have." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers in a quiet, intimate gesture that said everything they weren't ready to put into full words yet. Their breaths mixed in soft clouds of warmth. The world around them was silent, peaceful, waiting. Finally, he whispered with a soft laugh, "Next time, can we have a normal day instead of a life-threatening storm?" Sandra laughed gently, her smile warm. "No promises." They stood there for a long moment, the storm behind them, the sunrise ahead. Inside the cabin, Leela and Milo slept safely. Outside, Keanu and Sandra held onto each other, not out of fear but out of newfound truth. The storm had taken everything fragile and left behind everything real. And together they walked back inside. Into warmth, into healing, into something new.